Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. Inshallah, we'll get started momentarily. My name is Munir Sheikh. I'm here on behalf of Bayan Claremont. It's an Islamic graduate school not far from here in Claremont. Perhaps some of you have heard of Bayan. It's a graduate school where we offer master's degrees in Islamic studies and leadership, Islamic education, and Islamic chaplaincy. Alhamdulillah, this fall, as we're underway in the fall semester, we have about 20 new students who have joined our program, joining about 40 existing students. Bayan started in 2011 to provide higher education for Muslims who want to go into certain fields and become professionals in those fields, such as chaplaincy. And of course, school teachers and school administrators and leaders for our masajids and our community organizations. So we're very happy to be here this evening at IOK. Whenever we have our faculty come to visit, to teach our courses, we try to provide opportunities for the community to have access to our faculty as well. This evening we have Sheikh Walead Mosaad from Pennsylvania joining us. He's a renowned scholar, and we're very happy to have him as one of our faculty members. One of the things we like to do at Bayan is to ensure that our students have access to a variety of scholars from different perspectives. We have courses that are very academic, as well as courses that are very practical, that inculcate skills in community organizing, in public speaking, in civic engagement, and interfaith relations. Last week, we had, and we do our courses in an intensive format where our faculty come for 6 days and they teach a morning block or an afternoon block of 5 hours each day. So that's 30 hours per class. So for students, if they're taking 4 classes, that's 120 hours of contact time with 4 different professors. Last week we had Dr. Asifa Qureshi Landis teaching Islamic law. We had Dr. Suad Abdul Khabir teaching an Islam in America course. This week, we have Sheikh Walead teaching an Islamic leadership and spirituality course. And we had Dr. Mukhtar Ali teaching a course on Sunni-Shia relations. So these are very important topics, and mashallah, we've had a wonderful time. We know that there are other circles of learning here in Southern California, as well as around the country. IOK, of course, has its own very robust educational curriculum and program, and we're very happy to have a partnership with IOK and some of the other masajid and organizations, because we believe that we can mutually reinforce the good efforts that all of these organizations are doing to raise the standards of education and leadership in our communities for the needs of our communities. And I just wanted to give you a little bit of background of what Bayan is, in case you have not heard about it. And we look forward to continuing to do these kinds of programs. This evening, you'll get a little bit of taste of what our students have experienced in the classroom at Bayan in Claremont. And I'm going to turn it over to Sheikh Walead now. Thank you once again. If any of you are interested in knowing more about Bayan, or if you have family members or friends who might be interested in pursuing a master's degree or even a certificate in Islamic studies and leadership, we have literature outside after the program. We'd be happy to talk to you. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلوات وأتم التسليمات على المبعوث رحمة للعالمين سيدنا وحبيبنا وقرة أعيننا النبي الأمي سيدنا محمد بن عبد الله بن عبد المطلب وعلى آله وأصحابه وأزواجه ومن اهتدى بهديه ليوم الدين. تركنا المحجة البيضاء ليلها كنهارها لا يزوغ عنها إلا هالك. ثم أما بعد. So first I'd like to thank the Bayan team and the IOK team for inviting us to address you this evening after Isha on the blessed day of Jum'ah and the blessed eve of either Tasu'a or Ashura of Muharram. Muharram min al-Ashhur al-Hurum. Muharram is from amongst the sacred months, so it's a blessed month, and also we're remember the sacrifices of those made before us, specifically Sayyidina al-Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam radiyallahu anhu. So the topic for tonight that I've been asked to address, spirituality in the modern world, and I think it's good to kind of define terms before we kind of think about that topic. So when we say modern world versus pre-modern world, and when we say spirituality versus materialism, because usually you understand things by its opposites. So what is it about the modern world that makes it modern? And what is it about the spirit or spirituality that makes it different than the material aspect of the world, right? And I would submit to you that the whole idea of spirit versus material and modern versus pre-modern is not something that's rooted in an Islamic paradigm or perspective. It's something kind of we've inherited by the fact that we live in these societies that have their own history and they have their own narratives and they have their own ideologies, and these things developed independent in some ways of what was happening in the predominantly Muslim world. So we've come then to address these things from our, or what we try to do, our perspective. And I think the notion that the world is modern is one we have to be careful with, because it's as if there is a type of tension or a type of understanding that somehow it's hard to be spiritual in the modern world, right? Like the modern world doesn't help you to do that. There's kind of things and obstacles that are working against you to achieve some type of spirituality, as it were. But then we have to define, well, what does spirituality mean, right? And what is it about the modern world that makes you feel like I have a hard time doing that? So for argument's sake, we're going to say that's true, even though we have a problem with the whole concept to begin with of material versus spiritual and modern versus pre-modern, or now we even have postmodern. I don't want to get into a whole kind of philosophical discussion about what all that means and so forth. But I think all of us can agree, especially those of us who have lived beyond 40 years maybe, that you've seen quite a number of changes. And those of us who have already gotten to the grandfather stage, certainly the grandkids are acting and doing and living in a much different way than you remember you used to do. And probably you can make the same statement definitely for your own children, especially if you immigrated to this country from somewhere else, right? If you came from Karachi, or if you came from Cairo, or if you came from Mogadishu, or wherever you came from, certainly it's much different than what you're used to. And the difference is that these are times, because I'm not going to say societies, because this is even true for the so-called Muslim world now, where there is a predominance of the profane as opposed to the sacred. So something sacred is something that you think is beyond reproach, something that is to be of such a high value that you take it as a matter of basic understanding and creed that this thing is beyond reproach, it's unassailable, it cannot be criticized. Not because you're unable to criticize it, but it is of such a high esteem that criticism doesn't make sense for it. And I think the biggest difference, if we're going to talk about modern world versus pre-modern world, is that there's no longer a sense of the sacred. And the only thing that remains sacred is that nothing is sacred, as they would say. So everything is up for criticism, right? The way that your parents lived, the traditions that you inherited, even what they now call heteronormative understanding, which means that sexual relationships occur only between men and between women and not women and women, not men and men. So all of what we used to think are not just as thawabit or things that are kind of understood to be necessary and highly esteemed from religion, but even things outside of religion. Even things that were widely accepted not too long ago as being something that is integral to the human condition. And now we find these things being challenged, right? And the envelope gets being pushed further and further and further out. And there is no telling where that's going to end. You know, today when we be talking about what I just mentioned, in a few years we can be talking about incestual relationships. And that how if there's a consenting uncle and niece, then why should we oppose it if they both agree to it? Because if we go by the so-called value system that why these things have been understood, then you could reach no other conclusion if you're going to apply the same principles, right? If it's just about the individuals and it's not about the greater community, and it's not about the very fabric of society. So then the question becomes, well, what is a Muslim to do in all of that? How are they to contend with it? How are they supposed to kind of maintain their own sense of the sacred and their sense of spirituality, as it were? And I think the answer to this lies within us. We have the answers. We just have to go and apply them. It's not like we have to go searching for them. And the beautiful thing about the deen is if you do follow it deliberately and religiously, you will find all of those things that you're looking for. You will not be disappointed. And amongst the things that we hold to be true for all times and all places, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows better than we do. And that even though we may not understand the reason behind certain things, we have this sense of submission to the idea, even though we don't understand it, that Allah is the one who understands it. And ultimately He knows what is best for our condition and what is best for ourselves and what is best for our children and our grandchildren and so forth. So then the task remains for us to, number one, acknowledge all of that, and number two, to live as though we abide by that acknowledgement. So not just to give it lip service, not just say, well, yeah, I believe all of that, but, you know, I'm going to live my life this way. You know, the ulama, they talk about at-tasdeeq wal-id'an. Tasdeeq means that you affirm things to be true, but there's another step after that, right? Id'an means you actually not just affirm to be true, but now you have the resolve within you, and you're going to say, I'm going to live my life this way, because if 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are true, then how else can I go about living my life? It has to be this way. And in the face of the many challenges that we are facing today, I think there is no other priority. I'm not going to say it's the highest priority. It is the priority. There should be no other priorities to begin with, because this should be a thing that should be consuming us, and we should be spending our days and nights about how we're going to faithfully practice this deen, how we're going to imbibe it within ourselves, and how we're going to pass it on to our children and our grandchildren. This is what should be consuming the time, the strategy sessions, the human resources, the financial resources of every single Muslim institution today on the face of the planet. That's my opinion. I believe that we have really no other mission before us right now, because unless we do that, I think definitely within a generation, 2 generations, maybe 3, certain parts of the world, there'll be either no Islam or an Islam that's unrecognizable. Islam you don't recognize anymore. That if the Sahaba were to come upon us and they were to look at us and they would say, like, we don't know what that religion is that they're doing, because that's not what we know. That's not the thing that we practice. And I think the key to achieving all that, you know, our only problem really, and the single problem that we have, is ignorance. And we have a lack of what I would call religious literacy. Our children need to be taught from a young age الثوابت الدينية, right? What are the anchors, the underpinnings, the musallamat, you know, the things that nobody questions. And we don't tell them just because that's the way it is, but we have to train them and show them why that's the way it is, right? We have to live not just within our households, within our families, but within a community surrounding us. Because I can tell you, if you're going to try to practice it in your family and you don't have a supporting community around you, it's going to be an enormous challenge for you to do that. Because sooner or later, your kids have to leave the house. And sooner or later, your kids have to go to school. And sooner or later, your kids are going to interact with other people. And invariably, they're going to interact, and they're, al-akhlaq sarraq, yani the character traits easily transfer from one to the next, especially for impressionable young people. So unless we're working diligently, right, to mold that impression according to the tenets of the deen and the principles and values of the deen, then they're going to be molded in some other way, right? You can't just prevent it, but you have to be proactive. And we, I think, need to re-emphasize what I would call the dhawqi aspects of the deen. There's this thing called dhawq, or spiritual cognition, right? There's an aesthetic aspect to the deen that has been lost in many places. In other words, the deen has always been something beautiful. Its teachings have always been something beautiful. And then the way that these things come out and manifest themselves externally has always become something beautiful. And we see a lot of ugliness from Muslims and by Muslims and put out on the world by Muslims because they haven't fixed the thing that is supposed to be the receptacle of that beauty, namely their hearts, right? So, they say that the heart is the sultan, the heart is the leader of what happens with the limbs, of how you act and how you do things in the world. And so if that heart is hardened, if it's coarse, if it doesn't properly reflect the reality, right? Because the heart is also not just a thing that affects your limbs, it is also affected by what those senses take in. And so if you have a warped sense of reality, if you feel that the whole world is a conspiracy against you all the time, and then your actions will belie that. Your actions will be someone who thinks everything is a conspiracy. And you'll be a paranoid, scared individual, right? Who'll be suspicious of others, who doesn't build friendships and relationships easily, maybe a little bit antisocial. So all of these things are going to come out because the heart is not in a good place. So we have to protect our hearts. And the Prophet ﷺ very clearly said, إِنَّ فِي الْجَسَدِ مُضْغَةً إِذَا صَلَحَتْ صَلَحَ الْجَسَدُ كُلُّهُ وَإِذَا فَسَدَتْ فَسَدَ الْجَسَدُ كُلُّهُ أَلَا وَهِيَ الْقَلْبُ. This is the morsel of the flesh that is of the spiritual realm, more than is of the material realm. يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ قُلْ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي وَمَا أُوتِيتُ مِنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. They ask you about the spirit, which is another name for the heart. Say it is a matter of the Lord, and you have not been given except a little bit of knowledge. And so one of the questions in theology that no one can answer is, what is the nature of the spirit? What is the nature of the life force within the human beings, such as that it was there before we actually were in these bodies, and it will remain after we leave these bodies, after we forsake these bodies? What is the nature of that, and how is it related to the physical, and where is it? And nobody knows. This is something of the divine realm, the divine knowledge. So that aspect of us that is ultimately unknowable by us, but knowable by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, defines who we are. That's really who we are. This external part here, what color you are, what ethnicity you are, who your parents were, what language you speak, even your sex, whether you're male or female. Souls, the spirit ultimately is genderless, and it's without color, and it's without ethnicity, and it's without any of the physical trappings, right? The physical attributes that we tend to define people. The soul is higher than this. The spirit is higher than this. And this is the aspect, our essential aspect, that all of the tenets of the deen, all of the practices of the deen are there to develop. Prayer is not calisthenics. It's not an exercise, a physical exercise. Each aspect of the prayer, whether it's the qiyam, the standing, or the ruku'ah, the bowing, or the sujood, the prostration, or the sitting position. These 4 positions, each one of them has a particular effect on that essential aspect of who you are, your heart. Each type of formulaic dhikr that you say, whether it's subhanallah or alhamdulillah, wala Allahu Akbar, wala hawla wala quwwata illa billah, wala salat ala Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, wa hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakeel. Each one of them has a particular effect on that essential aspect of who you are. And each time you say it, each time you pray, and depending upon the level of sincerity you do it with and the level of hudur and presence, it molds that essential aspect of who you are. It builds up your soul. It builds up your spirit. And then that affects the limbs. You become less tempted then to sully the soul, because the soul can get sullied and it can become impure in a sense by all of the distractions it goes through, by all of the things, all of those prohibitions. Essentially they're there to protect the heart and protect the soul. Because if you just go by the physical aspect, right? If you drink alcohol, it might be a pleasurable experience, so the body gets some benefit out of it, right? At least a pleasure. If you commit zina or adultery, definitely it's a pleasurable experience. So then why is it haram? The standard answer to that, the fiqh answer would be, well, there's going to be different societal effects, and alcohol clouds the mind, and if you're not of sound intellect, then you're going to make decisions that are, suspect. True. All of that is true. But also, it definitely has an effect on the soul, on the spirit, right? And it puts it in a state where it's less receptive to be spiritually cognizant, to make tamyiz, right? Because the soul will do 2 things. It was able to discern what's true and what's not true. That's your soul doing that. And its level of acceptance of the truth. And these are the underlying aspects of the deen, right? Do you accept the qada or the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Or are you mu'anid, or you don't accept it? And what I mean by accept or don't accept, you can say alhamdulillah when the musibah happens or the calamity, but maybe you don't really mean it, and inside you don't accept it, right? And that aspect of the soul needs to be trained to learn to accept those things, right? And sometime Allah, He trains you. Like for example, if you are given a calamity, there's a couple of ways to look at it. A musibah, something that's unexpected, you didn't want it to happen. The standard reaction of most Muslims today is, oh, subhanAllah, Allah's punishing me because I'm not a good Muslim. And that's, I would say, due to immaturity and ignorance of the spirit, of the soul. Because Allah is more generous than to punish you for something that you were remiss in this life. If He really wanted to punish you, He'll punish you in the next life. But in this life, He wants to give you that which is going to lead you to Him. Right? Allah will lead you to Him either by ni'am, either by blessing, or salasil al-imtihan, right? Or the chains of tribulations. But either way, you're going to go to Him. That's what Allah wants from us. So the one then who sees the calamity, the unexpected result, not as a punishment from God, not as a punishment from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but rather as a lesson, a sign. Allah is teaching me something, right? And you may learn more about yourself, and you may learn more about the divine realm, the divine presence in one night of calamity than you would in many, many nights of prayer, many, many nights of dhikr, many days of fasting. Right? Well, it's not a heaven sweepstakes, right? And we're all playing in some type of big Price is Right game, and the more points that we accumulate, then the higher station we'll have in heaven. And then we're all competing in that way. Then there's only so many seats in heaven, and so we have to beat out everybody else. That's not the way it works. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His khaza'in, right? His treasuries are so vast that no one can fathom them. There's no limit Everyone can go to paradise. Everyone can find salvation. Everyone can find redemption. And that neither adds to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and at the same time, everyone can go to hellfire. And that neither diminishes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So ultimately He is unaffected by what we do. So then why would you think that He's punishing you in that sense? Right? You have to think that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants the good for you. Right? He wants what's best for you. And so each situation that you come upon in your life, part of the way that your heart interprets these situations is looking at it from that aspect, from that particular divine perspective. But that requires you to be trained. That requires you to spend a lot of time on developing yourself and purifying yourself, rather than having sort of a knee-jerk reaction to things and thinking that it's something as punishment because you didn't pray Fajr on time yesterday and so you get in a car accident the next day. And that's the way Allah is punishing you for that. No, Allah is showing you something, right? And Allah wants good for you ultimately. And the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continues your existence, right? That you're still alive, that you're still breathing, that you still have an opportunity to realize your mistakes and return to Him, then that's an indication that Allah wants the good for you. And all of us are going to have that opportunity and continue to have those opportunities until we take our very last breath. That's the beautiful thing about the deen. باب التوبة مفتوح. The door of repentance is consistently and constantly open, and no one will be denied. If you really want it, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will grant that to you. So then spirituality, in our estimation, is not so much of a feeling of euphoria and a kind of aesthetic pleasure. That may be an aspect of it, but what it really is realizing and understanding that the mabani, the outward exterior part of the world, is not the whole world. There's something else beyond that. There's an inner aspect to the world. And that inner aspect of the world is not going to be perceived by your five senses. It's going to be perceived by your spiritual heart, right? But there are things that contribute to helping you to do that. And we said following the sunnah is one. We also said that there's an inherent beauty in such things, right? The deen itself is beautiful, and it manifests itself in beautiful ways. So why is it then that, for example, people feel more spiritual if they see something that clearly is sublime or divine in nature? Right? Like astronauts who go out into space and then they see the earth from the moon or from orbit. It's a sublime experience for them. It's something like they can't even describe it in words. And if they're not religious and they don't have a religion, they don't know the words to describe it, but they've had a religious experience. But they don't know how to use the words because they haven't been accustomed to expressing themselves in that way. Versus religious astronauts, like the Malaysian astronaut, they actually had to do some sort of fatwa to figure out how the guy can go pray up in space. Right? Where's the qibla? And like, how do you do sujood when zero gravity and things like that? So, you know, and even ourselves, like if we take a ride up into the mountains, if we see a waterfall, these are moments when people say, oh, subhanallah, look at that, that's amazing. How incredible that is. And if we walk into, let's say, a very beautiful, aesthetically ordered place like this musalla, right? You also get that feeling of subhanallah. Why is that? And the reason is because the order of it reflects the divine. People naturally incline to order, to structure, to things in proper proportions. And they said that the reason why one face looks beautiful to you and another doesn't is not so much the features, but the proportion of the features, right? Like the golden ratio that you find in arches and you find in you know, between shoulder width and between waist width and things like that. All of those things come into play because people are inclined to an order of things, right? To that inherent beauty in it because it's an ordered thing. So whenever we find structure and order in the terrestrial realm, we're reminded of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whenever we find chaos and disruption and lack of order, we feel disrupted inside, right? When we see a chaotic moment, when we see like a car pile up on the highway and people getting hurt and things like this, and just noise and disruption and cacophony and things like this, people feel a natural unease inside, a little bit of angst, anxiety, because that's your fitrah talking to you. So what happens then when people don't find that actually enticing, and they like that, and they want to be in the mosh pit, and they want to be in stuff like that? That means their fitrah has been affected to the degree that it can no longer make tamyiz al-haqa'iq. It can't discern what's right, what's true, what's valid from what's not, right? And part of it, if we're going to talk about the modern world, it tells you that nothing is right and true and valid. These are outdated words. We don't talk like that anymore. Right and wrong, right? It's whatever you think is right or wrong. So then the ceiling of understanding becomes how you feel about something, rather than is it inherently, does it have an attribute, an essential thing about it, that it's right or wrong, that it should be done or should not be done. And there's a long historical psycho-spiritual development behind how these countries, the inheritors of the European Enlightenment, which includes Europe, United States, Canada, Australia, so forth, how they got to this point. And it took centuries for them to get to this point. And at one point, they weren't like that. At one point, they were not exactly like the Muslim perspective or the religious perspective, even Christian perspective, but at one point, they were close to us in their understandings. When something would happen, people would look to the sky and say, this is God's doing. Nowadays, people think about, they attribute it to all sort of different sorts of factors, but the last thing they think about is Allah. The last thing they think about is God. And the Quran instructs us to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Not just to take it on faith, right? When people say take it on faith today, it means your best guess. I hope that there's a God, it kind of indicates that. No, we have to know. Know it more, know Him more than you know yourself. If you know yourself, you have to know God. Because if you know that you didn't come out of nothing, and there's no other force that's capable to bring you about and to bring the universe about, and ultimately to bring the dissolution of the universe, that only force can be something beyond all comprehension, beyond anything that we've seen, and we call that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You have to know that with certainty, with absolute certainty. But we live in a society, in a world of absolute doubt, and everything is relative, and you can't be certain of anything. And the only way we can reach certain conclusions about things is how many voices are talking about, where are the most votes, and so forth. Your spirit, it's not up for an election to figure things out. Your spirit has the ability to see truth and to see falsehood and to discern them. But you have to train it. You have to put it in that position. And the way that you train it is avoiding all the prohibitions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because every time you fall into one of those prohibitions, you chip away at its ability to do that. Every time you do one of those prohibitions, you chip away a little bit. Don't think that the images that we're bombarded with are innocuous and harmless, and it's just a fleeting image. And so what that I, binge watched Breaking Bad. It's just a story and so forth. But these images, these moving pictures, these things have an effect on us, right? I would wonder if people from 100 years ago looked at people in a cafe or walking down the street and they're holding these things and they're looking at them constantly, and even they're sitting across from one another and they're still looking at these things, right? I just thought if the Sahaba saw that, they probably think, oh, maybe those are Qur'ans that everybody's holding up, because I can't think of anything else they have a relationship with and keep looking at so often. But they're not Qur'ans, they're not masahif, right? They are things that oftentimes appeal to the worst part of who we are. So just as the soul has a higher part, it It also has a lower part. And the ulama use a different word for that. They call it the nafs, right? Or nafs al-shahwaniyah. The nafs, or the ego that looks to satiate itself and fulfill its appetites. And that is a big obstacle to a lot of things. We are instructed to fast, for example, because it keeps our nafs in check. We are instructed to look away from things we're not supposed to look at because it keeps our nafs in check. We're instructed to eat economically and modestly because it keeps our nafs in check. And when you keep it in check, then it opens up the higher aspect of who you are, your ruh, your spirit, for all sorts of other things, right? To be fulfilled in ways that the nafs couldn't even imagine. Couldn't even imagine them. But it can be fulfilled in ways that are ultimately exponentially more fulfilling than, you know, the pizza or the ice cream or the chocolate chip cookie, or, you know, or the fleeting passion and appetite that people go for, right? And most people are under the impression that that is the saqf, that is the epitome of pleasure. The Salihin, they said, they used to say, if people only knew what we found in the night prayer, in Qiyam al-Layl, even from that spiritual pleasure that we get, they would have fought us with swords over it. If they just knew about that, if they had some inkling about it. But most people don't know about it because most people don't do it, and most people don't even think. It seems like a burden, right? It seems like a burden, and the Quran describes the prayer as a burden for most people, except those people, Salihin and Muttaqeen. It's not a burden for them, right? So the nature of this dunya is that it's there with all of the enticing things to entice you and ultimately to disappoint you if you chase after it. And the things that seem burdensome that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks us to do, at the end of that long tunnel, you will find something more fulfilling, more satiating, so to speak, more enlightening than those fleeting things that you found before. Not just in the akhirah, in the dunya. You will find it in the dunya. But it's something that's food for the heart, not food for the body. Right? Your heart will be contented. And people today, when their heart is not contented, they try to make it content in a million different ways. And I think that's one of the reasons that leads to addiction, because all it's trying to do is either dampen the pain that it's feeling from the spiritual void, the vacuum, there's nothing there, or it's falsely led into the belief that somehow you're going to find your satiation, your fulfillment, by going into those things that are addictive in nature, right? Because there's a certain comfort when you go back to the same thing over and over again, and there's a certain pleasure in it, even though it may not be pleasurable of itself, but just going back to it over and over and over again. So the Deen wants from us to be the best version of ourselves, to be exemplars not just for those immediately around us, but for the community and the society. The Quran didn't talk about us and say, تِلْكَ خَيْرَ أُمَّةٍ أُخْرِجَتْ لِلنَّاسِ تَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَتَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنكَرِ وَتُؤْمِنُونَ بِاللَّهِ. Didn't say that about us because we're just like that, but there are shurut, there are conditions. تَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَتَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنكَرِ وَتُؤْمِنُونَ بِاللَّهِ. Right? You enjoin what is good, you forbid what is wrong or evil, and you believe in God. That's what makes you the best community. That's what's going to make you shuhada ala nas. That's what's going to make you witnesses for yourselves and for everybody else. But we will not reach that witness level, right? We will not reach that shaheed or shahada level unless we clearly and deliberately and sincerely follow all of the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Not just the ones we like, not just the ones that feel comfortable, not just the ones that we feel are compatible with the quote-unquote modern world, but all of them. Every single one of them. We need to be following it. We need to be applying it. We need to be teaching our children that, and not just making a salad buffet out of our deen and picking and choosing those things we find personally appealing, and those things that we don't find personally appealing, we kind of put it on the side. You know, the Sahaba didn't bother to ask the Prophet ﷺ, is this a fard or is this a sunnah? Is this obligatory or is this not obligatory? They didn't even use those terms. They didn't use those terms. They didn't say, is this obligatory? And is this sunnah, or is this mandub, or is this makruh? These are terms that were later developed by the fuqaha, by the ulama, so as to make some semblance of all of the deeds that the Prophet ﷺ did, because one can't possibly do all of them. And so they had their way of qualifying each one so that it would make it easier and facilitate for people to actually follow the deed. But otherwise, we should be doing our best effort to follow each and every single one. And when I say following the sunnah, I'm not talking about dressing a particular way, wearing a kufi, or those are parts, modest dress is a part of the sunnah. The exterior things, definitely. But what we really need to do is the interior things, right? We need not just to emulate the Prophet ﷺ in words and deed, but in states. Because it was the state of the Prophet ﷺ is what made the ummah. And that's what made him an-Nabi al-Ummi. That's what made him the unlettered prophet. That's what made him Habibullah, the beloved of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What was inside? What was his states? And the companions described some of those states, right? They said you couldn't tell if he was angry unless there was a vein between his eyebrows that kind of moved a little bit. They said that he was more beautiful than the moon on the full moon night. كان فخما مفخما, right? He was grand and he was made grand. These are the words that they used to describe the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And he was so grand that oftentimes they couldn't bear to look at him directly because he was just light. It was too much for them to see. And these came out of the internal states of the Prophet ﷺ. He was the most compassionate, he was the most merciful, he was the most courageous, he was the most generous, he was the most humble. He was the most sincere, he was the most honest. All of those things, he was, all of them, and those were things that were inside. Aisha was asked about him, what was his character like? She's like, don't you read the Quran? كَانَ خُلُقُهُ الْقُرْآنِ. His character was the Quran. Right? Where is our relationship with the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? The Salaf, they used to say, we wouldn't leave the house before reading something of the Quran. We couldn't imagine just going out there and we didn't have we renew our connection with the Quran. Not we renew our connection with Facebook and Twitter and see how many emails I got, and then I go out of the house. Even if you were to spend 1 minute just reading one page of the Quran, either with understanding or without understanding. But if you allow yourself, you open up your heart to that, you will be effective. And our teachers told us three things. They said, if you do dhikr, saying subhanallah walhamdulillah, and if you do read the Quran and the prayer, the salah, if you don't find anything in those three things out of a spiritual kind of connection, the problem is not with those three things, the problem is with you. And that should be setting off alarm bells inside you to say, well, wait a minute. If none of those three are doing anything for me, then I need to go into spiritual intensive care, right? Because, your spiritual EKG is flatlining at this point, right? Because we can't find a pulse. If the prayer doesn't mean anything to you, if dhikr doesn't mean anything to you, if reading the Quran doesn't mean anything to you, then we have to use intensive care measures upon you. What are intensive care measures? You have to question the rhythm of your day and your lifestyle. Are you eating from the halal? Right? Is your income from halal? People downplay that, but it has an effect on your spiritual state, right? And then the amount of food you're eating, the way that you're eating, the things that you see during your day. How do you treat people, right? What is it that you think about? So if those things are off, then definitely they're going to affect your connection in the spiritual sense. In other words, spirit is all around us. You can go to the Grand Canyon and say subhanallah, or you can go to the Chinese theater in Los Angeles and also say subhanallah. It's all God's country, it's all God's earth, it's all something that Allah breathed life into it and it's there. But your ability to see it, to perceive it, will be dependent upon what's going on in your heart. Someone related, for example, the Prophet Jesus. alayhi salam, him and his disciples passed by a dead dog, rotting flesh in the street, and they said, oh, ma aqdar hada shay, or something like that. How disgusting is that dog that's rotting there, and people just left it and so forth. What did the Prophet Isa alayhi salam say? Jesus, he said, how white are its teeth. Look how gleaming white its teeth are. Right? So even in the darkness he sees light. If you think the whole world is darkness, and it's all dark, and there's no hope, and there's no return, well, the Prophet ﷺ said about you, "Man qala ahlaka nas fahuwa ahlakahum." Whoever said that the world is destroyed and all is lost and let's all be desperate, then he is the one who did that to them, or he is the one who is the most desperate and destroyed out of them. The world isn't really like that, because the world is still in Allah's hands. And so, yes, there are challenges, yes, there are difficulties, but that does not remove, number one, our responsibilities, and number two, that there's still going to be inherent divine beauty in everything. But where are you in here, right? Can you feel it? Can you see it? And how many are the men and women of God who are always smiling, who see the light in things, who when you greet them, you're reminded of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? They don't remind you of the ugliness of the world. They remind you of all the great things and good things that can be about the world. And those are the types of people who want to be. Because if there's enough of us like that, then the world will change. The world will be different. Then the ugliness that you perceive will be changed into beauty. And you can always meet an ugly situation by the way that you deal with it. You can make something ugly more ugly. You can fan the flames. You can pour oil on it. Or you can beautify it. You can put out the flames. Someone treats you horribly. Someone slights you. You can get in their face too. And you can get into an escalation. And maybe you get into a fighting match after that. So ugliness on top of ugliness on top of ugliness. Or we can follow the Quranic injunction, وَأَن تَعْفُوا أَقْرَبُ لِلتَّقْوَى. And to pardon someone is closer to taqwa. And you can let it go. Or you can follow the Quranic injunction, خُذِ الْعَفْوَ وَأْمُرْ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَأَعْرِضْ عَنِ الْجَاهِلِينَ. خُذِ الْعَفْوَ, be pardoning, وَأَعْرِضْ, وَأْمُرْ بِالْعُرْفِ, and command to the common good. وَأَعْرِضْ عَنِ الْجَاهِلِينَ. Someone is reacting with you in a reactive way, in an emotional way. أَعْرِضْ عَنْهُ, turn away from them. You don't have to engage with them when they're like that. You don't have to fan the flames, right? This is what people see of who we are. People are not going to see how much Quran we read, or how much dhikr we do, or where we prayed the Eid prayer, or any of that stuff. But what they're going to see and how they're going to perceive us is, how are these people when we interact with them? What's it like to be around one of them? Right? People are saying Muslims are this and Muslims are that, and they're these horrible people. I want to ask them, did you actually interact with one of them? Did you ever meet one? Did you sit down with one? Did you share a taxi with one? Did you have one as a co-worker? Were you ever treated by a Muslim doctor? Any of those things? Because we have to try and ensure that every single interaction that we have with everything, living thing and non-living thing, the minimum that we should strive for is that that thing is in at least a good as or better state than before it met us. That's what we should strive for. That barista at Starbucks that you dealt with, and you just kind of treated them like a machine and not a person, or you treat them like a person and maybe you brought a smile to their face, is that not leaving them in as good as or a better state than when you first interacted with them? And that's about strangers. What about your own household? Right? When you walk down those stairs and the kids are getting ready for school, they're looking at your face to see, is this going to be a good day or is this going to be a sad day? If you come out all gruff and rough and stressed out about what you have to do at work or what's happening, this is going to transfer to your children. The Prophet ﷺ had the biggest a'ba, he had the biggest burdens upon him. But yet they said about him, كَانَ دَائِمَ الْبِشْرِ. دَائِمَ الْبِشْرِ. His face was always approachable, smiling, loving, exuding light. Should we not be that way too? Even if we have a million things that we're worried about, when we come down those stairs and they're looking at us to how they should feel and interact the rest of the day, maybe they're not in a good mood. But you have the power, Allah has given you the opportunity to change somebody's mood, to change their outlook, to change their perspective, especially the people that live in your house. The Prophet ﷺ, he made the barometer of how good a person you are is how you interact with the people inside your house. Because he said, خَيْرُكُمْ خَيْرُكُمْ لِأَهْلِي وَأَنَا خَيْرُكُمْ لِأَهْلِي. The best of you are the ones who are best to their families, and I am the best of you to the families. He didn't say who's ever in the first row in the masjid. He didn't say the ones who gives the most zakah or the most sadaqah or prays the most nawafil. He didn't say those things about being the best, but the best manifesting itself in how you come out to others and how others perceive you, and the beauty and the blessings that you can bring them by the way you interact with them. That's how we can be more in tune with who we are and more in tune with the great legacy of this deen, and then we can bring it to others. So no matter how difficult the situation, no matter how dire the circumstance you can be, there are always things you could do within yourself, to meet those challenges. And certainly we don't have it as difficult or as rough as many of our predecessors, by no stretch of the imagination. Definitely not the persecution and the difficulties the Prophet ﷺ had in Mecca. But he was forbearant, and he was patient, and he told the others to be patient. صَبْرًا يَا أَهْلَ يَاسِرْ فَإِنَّ مَوْعِدَكُمُ الْجَنَّةِ. Have patience, family of Yasir. Our abode is going to be paradise. And he promised people that you're going to see these great things happen. Just be forbearant. And, if you are patient, if you are forbearant, then know that it is darkest before the light. There's definitely good coming to this ummah. Al-khayru muqbil. The question is, are we going to be part of that good that's going to bring it, or are we just going to be participants on the sidelines watching it happen and have no allotment of it? So I think in these blessed days, Allah says about these days, وَتِلْكَ الْأَيَامُ نُدَاوِلُهَا بَيْنَ النَّاسِ. These are the days that we circulate amongst people. There's always an opportunity. Tomorrow always represents another opportunity. And that tomorrow always represents an opportunity for you to change and do something different and have a completely different outlook. And Allah always gives you that chance. So renewal is a very strong theme in our deen. And every act of worship is indeed kind of an act of renewal. So every prayer that you do, you're kind of renewing yourself. You come out different than the way that you went in. And every day that the sun sets and then every day that the sun rises, it's also a type of act of renewal of the earth. And you can follow in that renewal. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to continue to bless us, to show us, to give us good teachers, to give us a clear and sound understanding of this deen so that we may practice it, we may apply it, we may teach it to others, and to bless this community here and other communities like it around here to continue in the good work that they're doing, the folks at Bayan and here in IOK and any other communities out there and in different places. There's a lot of good going on in the ummah, and the important part is just to be a part of it. And begin with yourself, begin with your household, your family, your local communities, and beyond. And if you do the good and you see the good, then you'll find the good, inshallah. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Jazakumullah khair. Should we take questions or it's too late?